Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Many water has gone under the bridge in the Arab region recently after an assumption that the Arab Spring has faded forever. And all of a sudden, crowds in Algeria and Sudan took to the streets demanding the removal of the regime. And the Sudanese movement has led to al-Bashir, ousting of al-Bashir of Sudan. This could lead to a more democratic future and more prosperous future. However, serious concerns came up to the surface regarding attainment to a true change in regimes and the way militaries and governments might respond to such renewed demonstrations, and the future political perspective for Sudan and Algeria has become more ambiguous. And for a civilian rule in the horizons in Sudan, things remained as they are between political pushes and pulls, and the coalition of change and democracy, particularly after attacking the demonstrations in front of the military headquarters, and the Algerian movement has put conditions to remove all symbols of the former regime before going into any negotiations. Therefore, would the demonstrators of Algeria and Sudan would be successful in getting rid of old regimes, and would such movements spill over other countries in the region, to bringing to our minds the 2011 revolutions? And what are the learned lessons from the first wave of the Arab Spring, which some people might consider its implications in Egypt has come to a conclusion with the death of former President Mohammed Morsi during his trial yesterday, being the first civilian elected president in Egypt. Such questions and many more would be the themes of our seminar today, that is organized by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and Al Jazeera Mubashir in collaboration with Brookings Institute. Please bear with us. We will review with you a couple of statements by the military council leaders in Sudan. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, the sound is not very clear. It's very hard to translate what is being said.
We are very well aware that people's lives are important, and so is the homeland, and our homeland requires sacrifices from everybody. Since its inception, the revolution has the revolution has received a lot of blood from everybody. However, the regular army is in charge of protecting the homeland. And the only thing that our armed forces did was protect the revolution and protect Sudan. We sought no power because we know that the only key to power is the ballot boxes that are controlled by the Sudanese people alone. And the armed forces are attempting to assume various responsibilities. We are not trying to oust any political forces, and we are not trying to rule Sudan unilaterally. We are not trying to copy the experience of other totalitarian regimes that lack popular support and do not enjoy popular satisfaction and place Sudan in a real danger. So we often talk about civil powers. A civil power will be represented by the Council of Ministers and not a military council. Let us be clear. We want a government. We want a technocratic government. We want a government that is built upon competence and not a transitional military council. We want a comprehensive deal a deal that will be approved by everybody, a deal for for all the people of Sudan. The and any mandate will come from the people of Sudan themselves, not from the army, not from anybody else. We are ready to take to the streets in millions in order to affirm that. The people who are in charge have destroyed the country. They have wreaked havoc on our country, and now they are in Khartoum, they are in charge, and right now they are talking about conspiracies behind the scenes, conspiracies behind closed doors, but it is they who have destroyed our country.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Would like to welcome with us Mr. Abdul Wahab Al Afandi, Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Doha Institute. Mr. Al Hawazi Taqiyya is researcher at Al Jazeera Center, political science professor at University of Kuwait. I would like also to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen. We will spare a chunk of our time to open the floor for questions to our panelists and to leave also a room for our followers on social media. We will start our discussion giving 5 minutes for each one of our guests for every theme of the seminar. Mr. Abdul Wahid Al Afandi, the Sudanese are some of the most Arab peoples who have revolted against their rulers. So how would you assess the situation now in Sudan between the pulls and pushes between the military council and the change forces after foiling and attacking the demonstrations in front of the general headquarters of the military? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is quite clear now that the Sudanese revolution and the change requirements are going through a critical phase. It's quite clear that it has started since some time. However, it has gained new momentum after attacking the demonstrators in front of the military headquarters with such a brutal way on the 28th of Ramadan. And such a scenario reminds us of the same approach adopted by the Egyptian authorities in Rabaa Square in 2013, and it seems as if the objective was meant to be a starting point to quench the revolution, and there are many forces, regional and international, that supports such an approach. From the other hand, such an approach is based on the countries that are sponsoring such an approach are placing their dreams in other countries. For example, in Libya, the supporters of Haftar, they say they are against the militias and they are in support of the national military. However, in Sudan, they are supporting militias against the national army, particularly such a militia in Sudan, which is tribal militia that is affiliated with a single individual. It could be a private institution of what used to be the private security organizations that are affiliated to one single individual. Therefore, you wouldn't be able to establish and lay the foundations in a country based on establishments and formations that are affiliated with a single individual. Therefore, people believe that those people who believe that the Sudanese military is weak, they need to support such a military, and such militias need to join the umbrella of the formal and regular army. You can't have several armies. This would lead to a confrontation. There are attempts in the Sudanese army or armed forces. There are some attempts that some people are trying to replace it with other militias, exactly just like what happened in Yemen. There are several elite forces supported and trained by foreign forces, Americans and others. This is quite a serious situation. Regardless of what we are discussing here today, here we are talking we're not talking about military versus civilian system. We are talking about a national regional rule against a privatized sort of regime that are financed and funded by foreign actors, affiliated with foreign actors, and they want to be the deciding party regarding the future of the country. This is quite serious. I believe that such an approach, first of all, it will not succeed, but it could lead to an armed confrontation and conflict and a civil war, similar to all the civil wars that we have seen in several countries. This could continue and could lead to a total destruction of the country. Unfortunately, people who are for such an approach, they don't care for the country, they don't care for the people. I believe we have a duty on our shoulders, we Sudanese, that we need to set aside all our differences and seek an approach or a way out of such a problem. We don't want the situation to become a civil war, for example. We don't want the country to disintegrate and to break it into pieces. We have a polarization issue in Sudan. It truly exists. And we haven't seen it in many of the Arab Spring countries. In Sudan, as we have seen, has a history of revolutions. However, revolutions are not made on demand, made and created by the regimes. When the regimes commit such a horrendous mistakes and plunders, they pave the way for such revolutions. In Sudan, we had the October Revolution, that when we were at the universities, we back in the day, we started to recreate it in 1973 in the same way, through demonstrations at the universities, labor sit-ins and party movements. However, it failed. The reason is that the regime at that time did not respond, uh, and the regime became a very bullying type of a regime. This was one of the problems we faced during that time. Therefore, revolutions in Sudan were very much expected and foreseen before last December. Many people were expecting to take place in January 2011, in which the South Sudan referendum has taken place, where the Southern Sudan people, more than 90% voted for separation. And there have been some attempts for revolution, was not successful, but now the revolution is there. And when it takes place, a polarization is witnessed, and this polarization happens when the regime is isolated and the peoples are united. We hope now, in light of the precarious situation in the country, that's the acuteness of such polarization needs to be mitigated, needs to be toned down. We are quite optimistic that this revolution will prove successful ultimately. However, the important thing is that we need to bring down the price that we have to pay for such a revolution. There is a high price has already been paid in terms of victims. However, we don't want the situation to be more of massacres. And this requires the unity of the military institution, and excluding the militias and working together among the street forces, particularly the supporters of the former regime. I believe it's a duty upon them to move and unite their efforts with the civilian authorities. Thank you. Of course, Abdul Wahab believes that Sudanese need to forget all differences in this historical pivotal moment and to lead the country out of such a crisis, which could transform into a civil war. Ladies and gentlemen, let's review the statements by Algerian Premier now, Al Ghaid Saleh, and then we shall resume our discussion. We need to stand on the side of these people who have exercised patience for a very long time. It is time for them to restitute their rights and constitutional legitimacy. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that our endeavor to resolve such a crisis stems out of our conviction that the Algerians people are capable of overcoming crisis no matter how acute. The demonstrations need to be reasonable and to have frameworks that can produce honest leaders that are capable of meeting the legitimate demands and to avoid any kind of chaos and avoid falling into the trap of suspicious conspiracies and plottings seeking to exploit such demonstrations to be a bridge or a vehicle to meet their ends and to meet unreasonable demands such as the comprehensive ousting of all elements of the former regime. Such a demand is unobjective and unreasonable, and it's malicious and dangerous. It is targeting the countries and the state institutions and to smear the reputation of such individuals who have served their country for a very long time across all levels. And it's not the right of anyone, whoever they are, to replace justice by leveling charges and accusations against them, demanding ousting them. Conducting elections in the nearest opportunity with the credibility. Such an exercise constitutes a necessary requirement to establish democracy in which we believe. Unfortunately, some of the followers of the hardliners, political hardliners, believe that elections is a choice rather than a requirement, and this is to conduct fair elections. If an administration is democratic, it means the involvement.
In Algeria, the protesters are still insisting to bring down all the symbols of the former regime before conducting any elections. The army, however, insists on holding the elections in order to avoid constitutional void. Mr. Al-Hawas Taqiyya, do you think we will experience real democratic transformation in Algeria, or will deep state manage to circumvent the demands of the people? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. To answer your question, I will talk about the current situation in Algeria with a particular focus on the last week or the past 2 weeks. There has been an achievement that was delivered by the protesters in Algeria. Obviously, Algerians do not believe that the experience of the Arab Spring was a very positive one, and therefore they would rather to call their movement the popular movement and not the popular protest. I mean, they have seen what happened in a number of Arab countries, particularly those where the protests have failed, and therefore they decided to refer to their protest as the popular movement. So the popular movement has managed to foil the elections that were supposed to be held by the military council. The elections were not conducted at the date on the date at which they were supposed to happen due to a lack of candidates. The result of that was a number of unconstitutional acts because the Constitutional Council extended the term of the president of the country until elections are until presidential elections are held, and they did that without actually setting a date for the presidential elections. The Constitution states that such a procedure will take 90 days maximum. However, this period was not actually respected by the decision that was made by the Constitutional Council, and therefore that is what the popular movement has managed to achieve. All the options that were presented by the current regime have failed. All those options have been foiled, and right now the people in power do not have a lot of options. Obviously, they were trying to impose a solution. However, foiling all those solutions can be described as an achievement, because at the end of the day, the popular movement has managed to prevent those in power from imposing those decisions. Another thing that describes the success that was achieved by the popular movement in Algeria was the peaceful nature of the movement. This is one thing that we saw in Algeria, probably more than Sudan. We had very large numbers of people who took to the streets. We had millions of people take to the streets all over the country, not just in one city or one area, and millions of people are still taking to the streets today. And those protests have been very peaceful, and this has helped legitimize the movement and legitimize what's happening on the ground. And right now, the military council, the people in power, have actually tried to use that to their advantage. They have tried to exploit this movement and talk about the legitimacy of the street. However, now it is the street that is legitimate. It is the popular movement that is legitimate, and the peaceful nature of these protests have encouraged everybody from all walks of life to participate, particularly women, because studies have shown that protests and popular movements that rely on the use of force will discourage certain people from participating, particularly women. And therefore, the peaceful nature of the protests has encouraged women to participate, despite the very large numbers of people who took to the streets, as I mentioned earlier. Another thing that we saw in Algeria is the large number of trials. We have seen a previously unseen number of trials in Algeria, a number of former prime ministers have actually been put on trial, and they have actually been put in prison, and the same thing applies to a number of senior military leaders and other members of the previous regime. And this could be an attempt by the military council to absorb the anger of the people and try to appease the people by conducting all these trials. The military council possibly thinks that this will appease the people who are protesting in the street, and therefore help lessen the pressure that is coming from the popular movement. However, from previous revolutions and historical studies of revolutions, we know that this is a double-edged sword, that these measures are actually a double-edged sword. We know that if you make too many sacrifices, you would be shooting yourself in the foot, because those around you will start wondering, if you do not protect these people who used to be your partners, who used to be your associates, then how are you supposed to protect us in the future? And chances are you will hold us responsible, and you will sacrifice us. You will be sacrificing us. And therefore, the strategy that is being applied by the regime is causing those in power to lose the people around them. However, they cannot help but wonder as well, what if we open fire on the protesters? Will the situation deteriorate like we've seen in Sudan? For example, in Sudan, the ruling general has promised to put those who fired on the protesters on trial. However, in the future, what will this cause? The soldiers who are supposed to guard the protesters will think, if I open fire, will I suffer the same fate as those in the past? And therefore, I think this is evidence that the Algerian regime is not a very steady one, and the proof for that is the great number of trials that have taken place. However, there are limits to the popular movement that is currently being conducted in Algeria. The general pattern of the popular movement is the large-scale marches on Fridays and student marches on Tuesdays. However, we don't have a variety when it comes to the types of popular movements. We don't have sit-ins, we don't have large-scale strikes, we don't have civil disobedience like we've seen in Sudan. And what I'm trying to say is that in Sudan, the civil opposition is employing various tactics that we're not seeing in Algeria, and I think this lack of variety is what enabled the Algerian regime to remain in power, to defend their choices, and to call for elections on their own conditions and not those of others. So the Algerian authorities still insist on conducting the elections under their own supervision because they are claiming that they are loyal to the country. They are putting the corrupt ones on trial based on the constitution that was approved by the people. And therefore, they claim that we don't need a radical change when it comes to the conditions prevailing over the elections. However, they are calling for rapid and swift elections because elections are a constitutional necessity and we need to avoid constitutional void. Lastly, another thing that is causing stagnation as far as the popular movement is concerned is the lack of leadership, similar to the leadership in Sudan. We don't have a clear structure. We don't have a clear body with representatives in various departments, just like we saw in Sudan and the civil disobedience in Sudan. Because having this kind of structure enables the protesters, enables the opposition to paralyze various government ministries and various government bodies and departments. We have seen that to a certain extent in Sudan, however, not in Algeria, even though there has been some dissension within the political establishment in Algeria, particularly within the judiciary. However, the scale of those dissensions has not been similar to what we saw in Sudan. And based on what we've seen in the Arab Spring so far, having the structure, having this body that represents the protesters, that represents the opposition, will reassure outside supporters and confirm that there is a structure that is willing and that is ready to take over once the current regime falls. And that goes contrary to the narrative that is championed by the corrupt regimes, just like we saw with the Syrian regime. And I think the Algerians need the structure. They need this body that controls the protests in order to preserve the peaceful nature of these protests, first and foremost, and to ensure that the protesters act in a peaceful manner, and second, in order to reassure outside partners and foreign partners, and in order to not allow the regime to claim that if the regime falls, there will be nobody to control the country, there will be nobody to rule the country and be a trusted partner of outside and foreign forces. Thank you. Like you mentioned, there are certain limitations. There are no large-scale sit-ins, no large-scale strikes, and this, like you said, has enabled the Algerian authorities to dig in their heels to conduct elections on their own conditions.
Dr. Shafiq Al Abed, many events or many waters have gone under the bridge. A perception prevailed that the Arab Spring was defeated forever. The question is, are we standing before a second Arab Spring? Will the demonstrators in Algeria and Sudan would be successful in getting rid of the former ruling regimes? Thank you. And it's a question that has many folds to it. If we consider the Arab Spring in 2011, we could call it the big Arab movement, and we can call it also is the return of popular political reforms after a long period of time with regimes that have stifled political activities. In 2011, I feel that it's still there. It has started with specific demands like sustenance, freedom, and social justice, accountable political system demands, and that a citizen needs to feel like a proper citizen, rather than write simply on paper, seeking to migrate to other countries that the Europe doesn't want our youth. We as Arabs, we have been imprisoned in such densely populated countries more. However, in majority Arab countries, we have been imprisoned, we have incarcerated without any venting outlets. The Arab movement, the Arab Spring movement, has shifted the Arabs from such a circle, stressing and confirming that there are options. However, the essence of 2011 hasn't been realized, it hasn't been attained. The regimes accuse it of being a foreign conspiracy, a Western conspiracy, a number of traitors, and they striked hard, and they became convinced that they could restore things as they were before 2011, and they failed miserably in that. The Arab regime needs to understand that the Arab Spring in 2011 was a historic shift in people's minds, how they deal with politics, with rights, with accountability, relationship with the rest of the world. Something new has emerged, and the majority Arab regimes have attacked it back. It is clear that the peoples have understood and digested such a thing. It's not strange that the Arab countries and the Arab world is full of prisons. It is not strange that it's suffering a more loose security situation. There are more divisions among the Arab countries. Many Arab countries have become failed states. Many Arab countries are unable to protect their own borders, but other things even carrying out its functions in terms of health, education, and basic requirements. Many of elite are migrating. Many opposition leaders are in prisons or underground. Such an approach will never result into civilization, will not lead to anything better. Therefore, the Arab societies is rich. It's oversaturated with the desire for seeking for an exit. What happened in Sudan, what happened in Algeria is part of this. The death of Morsi, may Allah bless his soul, has hurt many freedom lovers. He died in prison, an elected president. After 6 years of incarceration, he reflects the situation. He reflects the fact there is an issue of prisons, jails, and rights, and this is part of the labor that the Arab situation is seeking. Separation of powers, accountable government, a separation between judiciary and the president and the government and the legislation and the media, more favorable laws for freedoms and media, a civil society. We Arab societies, our communities, in order to mitigate and to reduce the difference between our societies and Africa and or Asia, we have a long way to go. So the solution proposed by the Arab streets is you need to open more space. We want accountability. We want the right to criticize and to critique, give us the opportunity to exploit the full potential of our society, political freedom. This doesn't mean disintegration and fall of nations, but rather is an exit to their crisis. We are still searching for a solution. We still have the legacy of 2011. The way I read the movement in Sudan and in Algeria, whatever you call them, it's part of this big labor that our region is going through. I can't tell if it's successful, if not successful. If it succeeds, it would protect Sudan, it would protect Algeria. If not, we would be into a more negative phase that would pave the way for a failed state Or, and what I believe is that this would evolve into it would evolve into even a broader evolution. We need reforms that allows dialogue and protects the interests of many elite and gives room for any political regime to shift into a more democratic regime. Otherwise, the Arabs would find themselves into a revolutionary movement that could annihilate everything that exists. We have seen it in Iran. We have seen it in many other revolutionary movements, or maybe civil wars. Everyone loses. We must we must let go of the conviction that it's either me or we divide the country, it's either me or destruction to all. The conflict in Syria can be read under this concept, under this context, is that Al-Assad has militarized the revolution in Syria and has divided the country. Has he succeeded? No. Has the revolution succeeded? No. Everyone lost. However, the issues raised by the Syrian revolution in 2011 remain the same issues. They will bounce again in a bigger form in many other ways, and the regime will not consider that he has protected Syria. He should have reconciliated with his peoples rather than depending on the Russians or the Americans or Iran or many other actors. The search for a solution with the peoples and representatives of these people, allowing public spaces to be open. This would help us to shift or to move to a better political system. The opportunity is still available, and the Arab world is in the deepest surge for a new political life. Since the independence of Arab countries from colonial powers. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shafiq Al Ghabra. So the movements and revolutions are part of a major labor which the Arab societies and the region is going through. Let us move now. Before we move to our guest through the satellite, let's listen to these statements which could be described as contradictory in the positions of the military leadership in Sudan. Honorable citizens, in continuation of the journey of the armed forces that started with ousting the regime, and the symbols of the regime, and with the help of Allah, with your collaboration and patience for your revolution to meet its destination. Honorable citizens, it is imperative on us to salute our youth and our people who have written history, setting the most excellent national examples, particularly the Sudanese women, through their peaceful demonstrations, and this has become clear in the seriousness of our youth, males and females, and their loyalty to the land, and we would like to salute such a revolutionary awareness. We implore them that we need to continue together to meet the objectives of the revolution. We have been very honest with them 100%. Their intentions have surfaced very quickly so you don't play weak until you press your rules. This country overnight, can you change everything overnight? It's impossible. That's why, and I swear to God that this country we will not hand it over except to honest people. Any individual who has an agenda, and we have said this, we will not step down, we will not give any concessions. You know that so and so individuals are we don't you think that we come from outside Sudan? We, the military, we have our bases. Those who have more popular base than us, let them stand up. Those who have more popular support than us, let them stand up. I would like to welcome our guest from Washington, Dr. Shilbli Talhami, Professor of Political Science and an Associate of the Middle East Institute with Brookings. Welcome, Dr. Shibli. The popular movement in Sudan and Algeria summarizes the Arab revolutions despite the ousting of the heads of the regime, such as happened in Algeria, Libya, and Yemen. The next step is to move to a democratic regime. So, how do you read the scene, Dr. Shibli?
First off, please forgive me because I did not hear the statements that were made earlier by my esteemed colleagues in Doha due to technical difficulties. And therefore, if I repeat some of the things that have been said earlier, please forgive me. In my opinion, if we take a look at the Arab revolutions, the revolutions of the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, the one shocking or surprising factor is not the fact that Arab peoples were in a rather new situation where they were displeased with their governments. The people of the Arab world have always been displeased with their governments. They've been displeased with their governments for decades. However, what was new about the revolutions of the Arab Spring in 2010 or 2011, I'm sorry, there's a bit of an echo in my ear. I'm sorry, there's a bit of an echo in my ear. Can we switch? We can hear you fine. Dr. Shibli, we can hear you fine. Please continue. There are some technical difficulties. I apologize. There are some technical difficulties that are affecting my statement. So please continue. Please continue, Dr. Shibli. Please, we can hear you just fine. There are technical difficulties, sir. Dr. Shibli, I apologize for these technical difficulties. We will circle back to you later. Back to my esteemed guest, Dr. Abdul Wahab. In an article in Foreign Policy, a lot was said about Sudan and Algeria. In that article, the author said that the protests are similar to the January of 2011 protests in Egypt, and the author wondered what could the protesters in Sudan and Algeria learn from the failure of the Egyptian revolution. So, Dr. Abdul Wahab, what do you think are the most important lessons learned from that revolution? Well, I don't completely agree with what's been said as far as the failure of the Arab Spring. I believe the Arab Spring has changed the face of the Arab world. And the greatest evidence to that is the election of the late President Mohamed Morsi. God rest his soul. President Morsi, as we all know, has died in circumstances that dishonor those who were responsible for his death. So we have a regime whose behavior led to the death of a former president, a regime that buried this president in the middle of the night. So when Abdul Nasser, for instance, repressed the Muslim Brotherhood in 1954, everybody remained mum. We heard nothing from the people. However, today, following the protests in Rabi'a al-Adawiyya and following the killings of dozens and hundreds of people, the street in Egypt is still moving. And people are still talking about media outside and inside the country. Egyptian citizens are voicing their opinions on Twitter and other social media platforms. And we even had the trending hashtag Leave Sisi, and it actually led President Sisi to complain about this. So the situation is different. People are a lot more aware. It is not possible to misinform people anymore, and therefore the scenery today is vastly different from what we had before. However, what I fear the most today is for people to learn the wrong lessons. For example, it is essential for people to learn the right lessons from the Egyptian revolution. For instance, the some people might accuse Egyptian protesters of not disbanding the army. However, this, in my opinion, is not a positive lesson, because at the end of the day, any peaceful movement needs to end with reconciliation. You had a regime in Egypt that ruled the country for 70 years, and the same thing can be said about the Algerian regime, and therefore you can't ask for all those people to be brought down and all these institutions to be disbanded and taken apart. So back in May of 2011, I actually called the people of Egypt to not put Hosni Mubarak on trial. He's an old man, he was an ill man, and therefore the revolution could have adopted a more conciliatory approach and could have opted for moving forward, and instead of wasting time with revenge, with killing, with retaliation, and a number of things that will just waste time. And therefore, when it comes to revolutions, it is best for those revolutions and for the transition that follows to be consensual and to end with reconciliation. And in Libya, for instance, we saw the same thing roughly 3 years ago following the revolution, and the decisions that were made 3 years ago led to the isolation of a number of people who were the leaders of the revolution, such as, for example, the Minister of Defense, who was the Minister of Defense of the revolution, the Minister of Justice, who was one of the leaders of the revolution, and without warning, those people found themselves isolated and found people who were much worse than them, such as Colonel Haftar, for instance. They saw those people in charge. And this, again, brings me back to my main point. The revolutions need to be consensual. They need to seek reconciliation. And this is the more important lessons. When it comes to the revolution in Sudan, I think there are a number of lessons from the history of Sudan, lessons that can help ensure the success of the revolution. For example, transitional periods in the past were quite short, and some people might call today for longer transitional periods, and I believe this is wrong, because this does not solve the problem. The problem is that there was a sound democratic transition in Sudan in 64 and in 86. However, the differences amongst the various political parties and the various political forces in play is what led to the problems. So today, the revolution has not succeeded yet, and there are some deep differences between the various forces participating in the revolution, and I think this will lead to problems. I believe the people need constitutional guarantees. They need strong constitutional institutions that will put in place the sound mechanisms in order to resolve conflicts. We've had a major problem in revolutions in Sudan since the independence. The independence itself was a type of democratic transition. However, those who drew the laws or drew the constitution were actually the players in power. So they always drew these laws and this constitution in a manner that suited them. And therefore, I believe we should have an independent body that is in charge of the constitution and the laws. However, Dr. Abdul Wahab, a number of people might actually disagree with you, and allow me to direct this question to Dr. Shafiq, and I will go back to you, of course, Mr. Al-Hawas. Dr. Abdul Wahab believes that one of the earlier mistakes that were made in the Arab Spring was putting some former leaders on trial. However, other people believe that one mistake that was made during the Arab Spring was not holding former leaders responsible. And they believe that not holding those people responsible is what caused ultimately the failure of this revolution. Contrary to what happened in Iran, for example, in 1979, what happened in Iraq in 1958, and what happened in Egypt in 1952. So some people said that those revolutions, those Arab Spring revolutions, did not succeed because they did not bring down the regime, and they were, in a way or another, soft in dealing with the regimes.
We need to consider that the political experience of those who have led the revolutions in 2011 had very young experience. They were the youth. They have led the traditional parties towards the revolutions. The conventional parties didn't even think about the revolution. The youth who were the ones who exploded, and like we have the page of Khalid Saeed, a particular type of people was successful in breaking the barrier of silence, the barrier of fear, the barrier of panic. And this what exactly took place after that, the ramifications after that. It is natural that the forces wouldn't run the subsequent phase in such a way that ensures a democratic transition or healthy democratic transition. The condition or the requirement might be an ideal is that the elite or key elements among the elite need to be convinced that the people have changed, the situation has changed, that requires a different treatment. The elite, the deep state, they striked in a way that the youth never expected, never saw it coming. They never expected the level of weapons, the level of lies, the level of killing, the level of control across all sectors, judiciary, etc., and leveling accusations and cases against these youth who led the revolutions. I believe many of the youth who led such revolutions, when they took to the streets, they were quite confident, relatively confident, that most likely the president will not shoot at us, will not open fire, or the army will not accept. I believe the Syrians who took to the streets never considered such a way of treatment. I believe in the beginning of all revolutions, they never demanded the changing of the regime, but after that, the president ordered opening fire, and then it evolved. I remember you can. Like in 2005, the Russian Revolution, it was a huge one. However, it wasn't successful in effecting the change, and because there was innocence. This innocence, I believe, innocence is disappearing in the Arab world. And to avoid anything similar to what happened in the Russian Union, that is very expressive, very revolutionary, very radical. When I look at Daesh and ISIS, for example, the region has everything. Those who can come up with ISIS, they can come up with a modern and brutal force, and doesn't produce a democratic regime under which you and I can live. But it happens in the history of peoples. These things have happened in the past. Therefore, I support that we need to look and search for reform opportunities, tolerance, transition. I believe from 2011 to 2019, there have been experiences. There are peoples who are learning lessons. Let's not forget the role of jails and prisons. The prison that produce many of the violent graduates of violent schools from Iraq, Syria, Egypt to Sinai Peninsula, etc. However, let's not forget the role of prisons, in idolizing, in creating hardness in a generation that is looking for solutions and continued balance. I believe there are many dialogues and discussions inside the rooms of and the cells of these prisons. We here in Egypt we have 40, 50, maybe 60,000 prisoners. Let's not forget about the exiles that brings together hundreds of thousands of Arabs in the diaspora around the world who have political and ethical values. Let's not underestimate the dialogues that transpires between them with regards to the future of their homeland. There is a new Arabic scene, there is a new battles, new information, new scenarios. This would lead to deepening the experience. Let me conclude with the reality in Sudan or reality in Algeria. It wasn't easy to appease the movements. They do want the military rule. They have seen their neighboring countries and what the military rule can provide them. They don't want to replace a despot with another despot. They want to replace that situation with an openness. Dr. Shafiq, when you spoke about reforming the regimes, was the revolutionary course the most appropriate for the Arab peoples that has many issues such as poverty, unemployment, and poor education? Or do you support those who said that we needed to press on reforms for proper governance? I believe with regards to the nature, whether it was peaceful or violent, studies or studies or revolutions and research, they have quite expectations. There is no specific timing that there are some elements when they come together, it becomes more likely, more eminent. What has been absent is the success factors, particularly studies at Harvard University conducted by Erica Shanwith about reasons that lead to successful revolutions. And this study covered since 1900 to 2006 and considered more than 300 revolutions or movements and the success factors for such revolutions to approximately 50 to 60% in recent years. Such ratios increased to 70%. Why? Because constraints on resorting to violence has become more international opinion, the media, and this would prevent armed forces or security agencies from using violence. This ratio, success ratio, has become scientifically proven because such a study has covered this, and the researchers, and we are talking about Harvard University, quite prominent universities, and they have even concluded some percentages. If the revolution or the movement of the peoples in any country, approximately 2 to 3% of the total population, they concluded that no regime can stand against or in front of such a movement. If the revolution sustains such a percentage of 2 to 3% and resist the security agencies attacks, like Tunis. We have Tunisia, for example, as an example. What happened in Tunisia wasn't violent. The reason behind that is that the armed forces didn't play a big role in the state government. Therefore, when the revolution took place in Tunisia, the armed forces didn't play a major role in the transition, has led to a democratic transition. Therefore, the peaceful nature of revolutions disintegrates the security forces. There are many factors: consciousness, the cohesion and interrelationships between the members of the security agencies and the society. Therefore, peaceful movements, peaceful agitations are makes it harder for the security agencies to respond violently, and it can galvanize large segments of the peoples. And the study has proven that the more participation, the less desire on the part of the security agencies to resort to violence. There were and it has been witnessed that in the beginning of the day, the security forces would try to provoke fights and instigate fights with the demonstrators. However, with a larger number of demonstrators taking out to the streets, debtors, the security agencies and the armed forces become quite confused. How can they control such masses at the national level? The key idea is that peaceful movements and demonstrations feeds itself, and this actually disintegrates and dissipates the violent response on the part of the armed forces. I believe the lesson learned from previous revolution is that our perception to the success of revolutions doesn't consider duration. In Egypt, for example, they made it to the presidency and it's appeared as if the revolution has succeeded. But no, the revolution is not the presidency, but also changing the rules of the game and guarantees that this could be sustained. In the Tunisian experience, there were elections. However, elections were not sufficient enough, unlike what has been thought in Egypt, that it would be sufficient. And I believe the formula that was presented to the Egyptians and the formula that was presented to the Tunisians, the deal itself, accepting to participate and engage in writing the constitution, to pay and paying the price of letting go of ruling. I believe Al-Baradi'i, Hamdi Sabahi and Mohammed Morsi, they started resorting to the armed forces, and the armed forces detected a crack in the revolutionary forces. Therefore, they took it as a pretext to protect the revolution from the supreme leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I believe this is a pretext by the Sudanese armed forces that they want a 100% unanimity to ensure that everyone is on the same page. The same thing happened in Tunisia. Those who won the majority, Al-Nahda, after the assassinations, the deal was this: either you give up government and we will work with you on writing the constitution. And the Tunisians were smart enough to let go of the government. They didn't want the rule, and they have agreed on the rules of the political actions. And this deal, which is, even if I won the elections, I believe this is the lesson that was learned, that the revolutionary forces, the more positions they have in power, they need to look for collaboration rather than consensus, rather than confrontation, because when they feel alienated, they might resort to armed forces to attain a particular position which they believe is in their rights. Therefore, consensus to maximize the revolutionary participation in powers, I believe this is a key lesson that we need to learn from the Arab revolutions. The only experience that brought these two elements together is the Tunisian experiment. Therefore, it's no wonder that violence wasn't big in Tunisia, and it's in historical experience. And reconciliation and consensus between elections and the rule has made the exception.
Thank you, esteemed guests, for your interventions on the lessons learned from the Arab Spring. We will now open the floor to our honorable attendants. Please be short in your questions and tell us who your question is for. Please, sir. Good evening, everybody, and I would like to thank the Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Brookings Doha Institute. And I would also like to thank our esteemed panel for today. First off, allow me to present my condolences and express my sincerest condolences to the Egyptian people and to the peoples of the world for the death of the late President-elect of Egypt, Dr. Mohamed Morsi. My name is Nizar Al-Haraki, and I'm the ambassador of Syria in Qatar. I believe you've said some very important things when discussing the second wave of the Arab Spring in the Arab world. Dr. Shafiq has spoken comprehensively about what happened in Syria. And I've been, in fact, a witness of the revolution since day one. I actually met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in early 2011, and I was very honest and clear with him. I told him we do not want to bring down the regime, similar to the slogans that were being used in Egypt and Algeria and other countries. We want to reform the regime. We want to reform the government. I personally told Bashar al-Assad, you are young, you lived in the UK, and you have lived the democratic experience. You are a doctor. And I really believe that we can reform the political process in Syria. I will stop here. However, what I still remember and what still pains me and what led me to say that is the large-scale destruction that was levied against Syria by Hafiz al-Assad. Now, I believe it goes without saying that the militaries of the Middle East have ruled over the peoples of the region for decades and decades with fire and steel. However, in Syria, our demands were quite peaceful. We wanted reform, we wanted justice. However, unfortunately, the regime relied on the old guard, and they just refused for a country that lived on fire and steel. They refused for this country to make the transition into a democratic country. And in Syria, we have paid a dear price, a very dear price compared to other countries. The same can be said about Libya and Yemen. All these countries have paid a dear price compared to the other countries of the Arab Spring. And of course, we hope that what happened in our country doesn't happen in Algeria or Sudan. However, I would like to say that we in Syria draw renewed power and energy today from what is happening in Sudan and in Algeria. And I would like to say today that the revolution in Syria continues today, despite the very heavy price that's been paid. And again, we draw power from what's happening in Sudan and Algeria. Thank you. Please. Thank you very much. I would just like to add one thing to what Dr. Abdul Wahab said regarding the revolution in Sudan. I believe that the start of the revolution was quite strong, was quite powerful. However, it was cut short by the military. What I mean to say here is that the military stepped in and they raised the banner of partnership. They did raise the banner of partnership. However, it was not a true partnership, so to speak, because once the military stepped in, the Transitional Military Council turned into some sort of a counter-revolution. And this led to this dichotomy that was mentioned by Dr. Abdul Wahab, a dichotomy that was heavily influenced by the ideological load, the right, the left, and so on and so forth. And another dimension was also added, the conflict between the center and the margins. It all started at the center and is stretching towards the margin. And just today, there was actually a meeting between the head of the TMC and the heads of the civil departments. And we're seeing a reflection of this situation in Sudan at the regional level. For example, the coalition between Saudi Arabia and other states of the coalition have actually offered their support to the TMC. Other parties have stepped in, the United States, the EU, the Troika, they actually stepped in with the African Union and with the opposition. So, just like Dr. Abdul Wahab said, this has created two opposing scenarios. Either we reach a consensus between the revolutionaries, and this is the preferred solution, even though it's the most difficult one, or we have a situation that will cast one of the parties out. And therefore, this brings me to my question to Dr. Abdul Wahab and to the rest of the panel. Following the conflict between China and Malawi and Malaysia in 1969, Tanko Abdurrahman had the following hypothesis, quote unquote, everybody wins. What he meant is we can unify all the objectives of the revolutions, we can hold those who are corrupt responsible, and after that we create a shared platform that will pave the way for a democratic regime. So, do you believe there's a possibility for those standing along the margins of this conflict to reach this solution, reach this end game, the everybody wins end game? Dr. Abdul Wahab, the question is for you.
Thank you. Please, can we have like concise and short questions? My question is to Professor Shafiq primarily and Mr. Abdul Wahab. Following that, you have mentioned the Arab system and the Arab regimes which we are seeing now. Before 2011, the axis was between Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and every region. What we are witnessing nowadays that Saudi's role were funding, and Syria and Egypt's role was the security aspects and militaries. Now what we are seeing are two fronts. The Arab regimes have produced the anti or counter-revolutionary front, and very brutal in their ways of dealing. The change that happened in the revolution in Sudan was a result of a visit conducted by the military leadership in Sudan to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we can see another weaker front that represents the peoples and their dreams. So is there any particular process, something realistic that can take us? At least we need to strike a balance in such a conflict between the strong and the ambitious. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sana Saleh. I'm a master's degree. Thank you, Dr. Abdul Wahab. Thank you, Dr. Shafiq Al Khabra and Al Hawas. I have two key questions. With aborting the Egyptian revolution in 2013 and the recreation of the former regime, the Egyptian peoples and the Arab peoples were very disappointed, and many wounds have reopened again with the death of Morsi. Now, assessing and evaluating the experience, it has been assessed and experienced and different, and the disappointments that the youth has felt post the revolutions. Dr. Shafiq always motivates people towards breaking the barrier of silence. The problem is that we can't place our fingers on the wound itself. We see a regime and we can't deal with the same mentality of this regime. We can't uproot them, and we can't bring them to our square. We are talking about two important revolutions, the Algerian and the Sudanese revolutions. Now the catchy phrase or title is the shifting sands. Where will shifting sands stop? Where would it turn into a solid rock? The question that we keep pondering about, we want a practical steps. We don't want any theorizing or explanation of the situation. We would like to hear some practical, tangible steps to the youth. My second point, very quickly, Unfortunately, we say that there are three fronts. We have the Maghreb, we have the GCC, and there are some other countries. What will be the role of the Arab countries again in the Sudanese and the Algerian revolutionary game? Please, I would like to stand for the martyrs and those who have fallen in the Arab Springs. Two key points. First of all, we can't talk about the Arab Spring without mentioning Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is the icon of revolutions and its role in the Arab Spring and how Al Jazeera was managed. My second point is the external factors, external interventions that have interfered in the Arab. I mean by this Iran and the Israeli factor as well. The Arab Zionists would have never, and to they could never pay Abdel Fattah Sisi $60 billion above the table without a green light of Israel. Netanyahu is managing the scene from behind the scenes. Mohammed Dahlan, Sultan Al Jaber is a state minister from the United Arab Emirates. I would like just to shed light on the Israeli role in the Arab Spring. I'm Mundir Sadiq from Sidra Hospital, and I'm a professor at Weill Cornell Medical College. The Prophet Muhammad has always set an example for us, and I believe that the revolution that managed to shift regimes and change regimes was the revolution of the Prophet Muhammad that has changed from pagan and societies into a monotheistic religion, and in a society that brought together different people from all walks of life under one umbrella. His tool was the presence of a leader and a constitution and individuals. Our problem is that we imagine that change can happen overnight. The Prophet Muhammad, for his success, it took him 13 years, and his initial attempts were focused on individuals, and Iqra, which is read, was the beginning. Our problem as peoples, we have some sort of ignorance. I'm very sorry to interrupt. We have only 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes, please. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to thank Al Jazeera Center for Studies. I would like to point out that we need to agree upon. With regards to Sudan, Sudan has preceded the Arab Spring that took place in 2011, 40 years before that, in the 70s, in the 80s, without any Arab intervention that would abort the Sudanese revolutions. Unfortunately, the current or the ongoing Arab Sudanese revolution has been aborted, or there are attempts by Saudi Arabia and the UAE to abort the Sudanese revolution. And the issue with Sudan is that in terms of ethnicity, Sudan is Arab and an African country at the same time. However, the attitude and the behaviors on the part of some Arab countries towards the Sudanese revolution will have its ramifications on the Arabism of Sudan. Because there are some demands that the Sudanese revolution needs to continue its course away from the Arab League, away from Arab countries, and this is quite serious that we need to pay attention to. I would like to thank everyone. My name is Bilal Yassin, a Palestinian researcher. I have a comment and regarding the Algerian issue. I believe it's injustice to classify revolutions as failure or successful. and we are moving across phases and stages and creating more spaces for more freedoms. It's beautiful to say that every country has its own specificity in terms of values and cultures and traditions. And the specificity of proximity or away from Israel. So if we consider Egypt, there was a full-fledged coup. In Syria, there were massacres and still ongoing. However, the Arab region is a bit distant from Israel, therefore it's quite different. There are other issues. I would like to ask my question about Algeria. What are the reasons that led to failure to form a unified leadership that can provide us options, that could provide us with a different tactic? Is it a cautious fear or is it something else?
We still have time for 2 questions, please. The last 2 questions. Please be short, ladies and gentlemen. At the end there. Thank you very much indeed. Hafiz Al-Hadla. I'm a journalist. I believe the 2 main conclusions from the Sudanese revolution is that it brought down the rule of the Islamic regime in Sudan, unlike what happened in Tunisia. Second, I believe the revolution prevented any type of normalization with Israel, because, as we saw, former President al-Bashir was trying to bring his country closer to Israel. So I believe the revolution in Sudan will be successful, and this success will lead to the fall of the Riyadh coalition that is currently supporting the Transitional Military Council. Thank you. Saifuddin Trabulsi. My question is to Dr. Al-Hawas. He spoke about the conditions for the success of the revolution. So my question is there a potential for a smooth political transition without necessarily having to absorb symbols of the old regime? For example, in Libya, we've seen the isolation that has taken place. However, in Algeria, the landscape is not very clear yet. In Tunisia, symbols of the old regime were absorbed and were integrated into the political process, and they have become a part of the political process. So would you say there's a potential for a smooth political transition without any members of the old regime? Thank you. Thank you, Salim. My observation is not about what our colleagues have said. We are talking about a large-scale change in Arab society. And just a general observation here, there was no female presence on the panel. We have spoken about the pivotal role that women have played in Algeria and in Sudan, and therefore I believe it would have been nice to have women present here during those discussions, to participate actively in these discussions. So in this renewed Arab landscape where we are leaving behind the days of old and moving towards better and brighter days, I believe it is high time to give women their voice, to give them their fair share as far as participation in the creation of our future, because women are at the heart of everything that we are going on. And we're always talking about their sacrifices made by mothers, made by wives, made by sisters. Some of those sacrifices are very painful, and oftentimes we hear of cases and of incidents that are very painful even to discuss. Therefore, I believe it is essential when talking about our Arab reality, it is essential for women to be present. I believe this female presence is essential when we're planning our future. Thank you. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank our audience for their questions, and I would like to ask you to be as short as possible in your answers. So everybody wins. Do you think that's possible? And what do you think is the influence of what's happening in Algeria and Sudan on the wider Middle East? Well, in both Algeria and Sudan and other Arab countries as well, the purpose of the revolutions was change. And this is very important because at the end of the day, we need change. However, I also believe that this radical change needs some degree of unity amongst the people. At the end of the day, the army would not have been able to rise to power without some sort or some form of popular support. We've seen what happened in Egypt. People were protesting. However, there was a chunk of people that was with the military coup, that supported the military coup. The same thing can be applied to Sudan. Some people actually supported the coup by the Transitional Military Council. However, today in Sudan, just like in Algeria, there needs to be change. Change is a major part of the process. However, at the same time, there's no way you can unite all political powers. There's no way you can unite all the parties. For example, late President Morsi, before he was ousted, they had the opportunity to expand their rule by including or integrating other parties. Had this happened, the army would not have found the gap that allowed them eventually to bring down President Morsi and rise to power. Another thing about Algeria, I believe the current leadership in Algeria cannot be a representative of the people. It is representative of a part of the people, and any true leadership needs to represent all the people and needs to have clear and reasonable objectives. For example, when Mr. Udwan was elected as prime minister in 2002, if he said what the revolutionaries in Sudan or Algeria are saying today about isolating all those in power, he would not have spent a single day in his seat. He would have been ousted immediately. So he waited for some time and then started to effect change slowly. So I believe this is the wise way of doing things. You cannot isolate everybody. Of course, you can start a revolution. However, with the revolution, you need to be wise, you need to be reasonable and realistic, and you need to ensure the unity of the people and expanding your base as much as possible. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hawass. Please go ahead. There are 3 points that I want to address. The first point about the failure of the revolution. Well, revolutions fail sometimes and succeed other times. Some revolutions succeed, and when they rise up to power, they rule the country with a renewed approach. This is not unheard of. We've seen it before. Some revolutions succeed, some revolutions fail, and I believe history has taught us that lesson. 2, why is there no real leadership of the popular movement in Algeria? I think there are a number of reasons, 3 reasons to be exact. The number 1 reason is that the Algerian regime has succeeded to portray the revolutionaries as partners in a way, or as participants in the political process, and therefore this caused some embarrassment to anyone who wanted to head or lead the popular movement, because they were accused of hypocrisy by the current regime. And even on the eve of the beginning of the revolutions, nobody expected demands to go so far as to bring down the regime or to reform the regime. And therefore, today, nobody actually has the audacity or the courage to claim that they were a leader, and everybody is claiming that they are supporters of the revolution and not leaders of the revolution. The second reason is the political culture in Algeria, a culture that says there are no leaders and there are no people who step up to be leaders. If we look at our history, we will see that the only hero is the Algerian people, the people of Algeria. They are the heroes. So there is a lack of individual leadership, there is a lack of individual political and popular leadership, and we don't have the same songs, for example, that are sung for leaders in Syria and other countries. However, this is starting to change slowly but surely, because a number of civil society groups have been meeting, they have been coordinating their efforts in order to submit proposals and to submit plans that reflect the demands of the popular movement. So we might see this might be the emergence of a leadership. Regarding the last point about the establishment of a new regime without the participation of members of the old regime, I believe experience in South Africa. The South African experience has taught us that this is not very useful. I believe the genius of some revolutionaries lies in the fact that they created something new, something completely new out of the old things that they had. And the good thing about revolutions is that they punish those who have done wrong and they reward those who have done right. This is the basis of any revolution. At the end of the day, humans are humans. If you encourage them to do bad, they will do bad. If you punish them for good deeds, then they will refrain from good deeds. And this is what we see in Hollywood films. We see that the hero is a member of the public and he says, I am a member of the public and I am for the people. However, he is the hero. So at the end of the day, it goes back to institutions and not to people. Experience has taught us that we can create something new out of something old, like we saw in Tunisia. Asepsi, for instance, has been in the political field for a number of years, and despite that, he has managed to achieve consensus. We received a number of questions on our social media platforms. One question was the following: do you believe there's a chance these protests might spill over to other Arab countries? Well, quite frankly, no one knows. When we look at the Arab situation, the name of the game is surprises, because the popular base is changing, the populations themselves are changing. Let's take Algeria, for instance. Right now, the general consensus is that Algerians do not mess around. Algerians do not mess around. We know that Algerians are pretty hard or tough people. However, look at the protests. Look how classy the protesters are. Look at how peaceful the protesters are. The same thing can be said about the revolutions in Sudan. So there is something afoot here. You know, regimes can try to paint our people as riffraff all they want. However, the change is clear. Despite unemployment, despite the bad economy, despite the lack of education, our people are learning. Is globalization the reason for that? Is YouTube the reason for that? I don't know, but there is change afoot. There is change in terms of administration, in terms of commitment, in terms of the joy of the struggle. You know, it might actually surprise you. I've spoken to some people and I noticed that they were really joyful. They were very happy and satisfied with what they're doing, because they felt frustration in silence. When they were silent, they were frustrated, and now they're finding joy in expressing their opinion. They're finding joy in voicing their opinions. They're finding joy in controlling their own destiny after long years of not being allowed to decide their own destiny. Even if they lose, even if they are pushed back, they have a say today. That is why people are banding together. That is why when we talk about the revolution and the counter-revolution. A counter-revolution is a counter-revolution. They're relying on brutality. They're relying on violence. They're relying on wars. They are relying on ties to Israel from one aspect. They're even more tied to the presence of Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump does not win the presidential elections in 2020, what will be the fate of this counter-revolution that has relied on foreign powers, has relied on brutality, and relied on foreign funding? This will not help. At the end of the day, you're standing against people who are moving, people who are looking for a reality, people who are trying to decide their future, because without that, the countries that colonized us would still be here today. We've been colonized by superpowers, the UK, France, and they all left. Even the United States are on their way out. The USA today is weaker. Of course, we all admire the democratic organizations in the United States, the civilization of the United States. At the same time, we hate other aspects that are related to the United States. Their ties to Israel, their support to totalitarian regimes sometimes, but even the United States are receding today. China is on the rise. India is on the rise. The global landscape is shifting. The United States, the population of the United States makes up 4% of the global population. Their economy used to represent 20 or 25% of the global economy, but today China, whose economy used to represent 1% of the global economy, represents today 20% of the global economy. There is a global change afoot. There is a universal change afoot, and this will be reflected in popular movement. People have been finding the way to voice their opinions and express themselves. This counter-revolution, in my opinion, is temporary. How temporary? Could be for 5 years, could be for 10 years. However, it's temporary. The important front today is the front of the people. The people are building this consensus, and they will express themselves with surprises.
Thank you, Dr. Shafiq. I would like to thank our panelists here, and I would like to thank you for joining us in this seminar held in collaboration between Al Jazeera Center for Studies and Al Jazeera Mubashir and Brookings Institute. Dr. Abdul Wahab Al Afandi, Dr. Al Hawaz Taqiyya, researcher at Al Jazeera Center for Studies. Thank you very much. Dr. Shafiq Al Ghabra, professor of political science at the University of Kuwait. I also would like to thank our panelists from who joined us from Washington, Dr. Shibli Telhami, and would like to apologize and regret his inability to continue with us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us, confirming, reiterating our promise to meet every month again, and thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.